afternoon, and welcome to the 16th edition of the Festival of Economics of Trento. We are very happy to have for this opening lecture Michael KREMER. Michael KREMER has already been to previous edition of the festival. He was here some 5 years ago, before being awarded the Nobel Prize, and has been devoting all of his research agenda to issues that are in between development and health economics, starting from the field experiment carried out just after receiving the PhD in economics, carrying out a field experiment in Kenya on issues very important like the deworming of the entire population. And it is because of the method developed in that context that he was awarded, together with Esther Duflo and Banjeri, the Nobel Prize in 2019. He has been a pioneer on studies of vaccines. Indeed, there is a book that I invite all of you to read very carefully, because this is a book that came out in 2004, and I think it has in it a lot of the issues that and the answers to the core issues that we are debating these days. How to fund the research on vaccines, how to make sure that they will be structured in such a way also to reach those who need the vaccine, how to make commitment from the standpoint of government vis-a-vis the private investors who want to invest on vaccines. These are issues that are discussed there, and I have to say that if one were to read this book without knowing that it had been written 15 or 16 years ago, one would think that it had been written today. Today, Michael will talk to us about what can happen next in this vaccination campaign, what can be done to increase its coverage, to reach those populations that really need, and there are many parts of the planet that are still running late in this respect. He will talk also about various proposals that have been put forward, including those of the Biden administration, according to licenses and other possibilities like dose stretching and so on and so forth. And today we will also have the opportunity to have a discussion of the proposal put forward by Michael KREMER, by Rino RAPPUOLI. Rino RAPPUOLI is a famous biologist and immunologist who has been not only contributing very much to research in this field, is founder of some fields of research on microbiology, as recognized worldwide, but he's also chief of research at GlaxoSmithKline, who is a multinational producing vaccines. So the discussion is going to be not only on broad principles, but it will be a very concrete discussion on the issues that we are facing nowadays. So without further ado, let me give immediately the floor to Michael KREMER, hoping that perhaps next year, when we will resume the festival having presence and there will be no longer travel restriction, he will be also in presence with us in Trento. Michael, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. It's would have nice to be there in person, but happy to do so virtually. So I've been working with a team of other economists and other experts since early in the pandemic to try to think about strategies to accelerate vaccination to help end the COVID-19 pandemic earlier. And I think the work, while useful for COVID-19, I hope, has also produced some insights about how we can prepare for future pandemics. And on the slide are a couple of the articles that we've produced from that work. I'll draw on each of those, but would also like to discuss some new work on pandemic preparedness. So we have, in this crisis, developed and manufactured COVID-19 vaccines at a truly unprecedented pace. At the same time, it still hasn't been fast enough. Many countries still face a very long delay before they can expect widespread vaccination. We've had damaging export restrictions and hoarding of vaccines. And I think we need to prepare now for future pandemics so that we can invest in advance to make sure that we have the production capacity for vaccines, that we have the right supply chains in place, and that we have better incentives for research and development, and that we structure those in ways that we can simultaneously promote the goals of inventing new products and assuring access to them. So let me start out, and of course I'm an amateur on these issues, but I'll start out with my amateur economist view of some background on vaccine development and production, and look forward to hearing a more accurate and comprehensive view. But one thing to bear in mind is that historically, most vaccine candidates don't actually succeed. There's a very difficult process of taking vaccines through the different stages of the process, and we have historical data on the rates of success at each stage. And this is a very risky endeavor indeed. I feel like this time we were actually, in some ways, we can congratulate ourselves to some extent in trying to, in the companies and governments and international organizations, trying to put some policies in place, and then the scientists and companies doing hard work on this. But I also think we were partly very lucky that we had so many successes. It's also very time consuming. So until 2020, vaccines usually took years, if not longer, to develop, and even longer to produce at large scale. Even with the urgency of a global pandemic, there was a survey in October 2020 of experts, and many of them thought that we would wait for 2021 until late 2021 for a vaccine to be approved. And the estimates were that we would produce just 115 million doses by the end of the year. So we've done much better than expected. Vaccines aren't just difficult to develop and to test, but they're also very difficult to manufacture. There's a saying in the industry that the process is the product. This is very unlike the situation for most drugs, where they're small molecules, and if the formula is available, then a new manufacturer can potentially copy that and produce a generic version. It's much harder with vaccines. And we've seen just the problems in production capacity in this case, often even just moving from one factory to another within the same firm. It typically takes years. Even just repurpose to construct brand new vaccine capacity can take more than 6 months to repurpose existing capacity. Okay. Let me note also that just an additional complexity is there are many different platforms for producing vaccines. So, some of them could succeed, others could fail, and then within each platform, there are multiple candidates. So background information is this is very difficult and very time consuming. Now, the flip side of this is that having the manufacturing capacity available is extremely valuable to society during a pandemic. And just to get a rough sense of this, note that if you take the estimates of the International Monetary Fund, they estimate that over a 2-year period, there was a $12 trillion loss in GDP. On a monthly basis, that's $500 billion every month. So and that's not even including the knock-on values beyond just GDP. There's obviously the health benefits, there are the costs of the epidemic to education as kids are missing school. there have been estimates that are many times larger than this 500 billion. So together with the team of researchers, we tried to estimate the value of each course of capacity, where a course is the ability to produce 2 doses for a 2-dose vaccine over a year. And we estimated that the social value of that capacity was around, for every unit of capacity, was around $5,800. Now, of course, in the middle of a pandemic, there are going to be social, political limits on pricing, or ethical limits. If you look at actual prices, they vary. The lowest cost vaccines may be $6 for 2 doses. The more expensive ones may be $40. Now, I'm not here to argue that the prices should be higher. Obviously, there are going to be limits in a pandemic. But I think we need to recognize that the huge gap between the social value of vaccines and the purely commercial incentives to invest. Firms may have gone beyond their commercial incentives, and they are getting some rewards. But if you think about, do you build out very early and do you build out very large scale, that's expensive and it's risky. And the private incentives to do that, the purely commercial incentives, won't match the social incentives in this type of situation where there are de facto limits on pricing. So that means there's a very strong case for government programs to incentivize early installation of capacity and large scale capacity installation. So early in the pandemic, we had proposed that one way to do this would be through advanced contracting. In particular, we suggested that governments pay to install capacity to produce enough vaccines for their entire population. I'll come back to that later, or recognizing, of course, that some people won't take it, but basically enough for their entire population for each of 15 to 20 promising vaccine candidates. Now, note that was a very large number, larger than was actually done. Why did we recommend such a large number? Basically, because we felt it was important to get many shots on goal. The success rate historically is pretty low. And so we thought it's given the enormous costs, even a small increase in the chance of success from having another shot on goal, we calculated was worth it. And what we proposed was that, what would governments ask for in exchange? We'd ask for the governments would ask the companies to agree to sell vaccines that proved to be successful. Because the suggestion was to do this before we knew which vaccines would be successful, that if they turned out to be successful, to sell them at a pre-specified price. And the benefits of this advanced contracting, first, it allows the capacity construction to occur in parallel with testing. And we obviously weren't the only ones suggesting this. Others, including Bill Gates and others, were suggesting this. And that this could also expand total vaccine production capacity. And speed is obviously of great importance in this situation. Now, what happened? Governments did invest in expanding capacity, and they did so through contracts that were quite similar to the type we would have advocated. Obviously, some differences. In particular, the U.S. and UK governments made very large investments, and we'll never know. You can always debate this, but it seems very likely that this significantly increased global manufacturing capacity. If you thought about the projections of what would be possible, we've greatly exceeded those. Was it worth it? Well, if we take Operation Warp Speed, the U.S. program, that cost $13 billion. If you take the estimates of just the economic losses, leaving aside the health losses, that would have paid for itself if it ended the pandemic just 12 hours sooner. So I think it was worth it, but we probably should have done more. The EU has obviously seen insufficient capacity, and many low and middle income countries are in an even worse situation. We estimate that the additional value, so even taking into account the production capacity that was already there, additional production capacity in early 2021 would have been worth $1,400 per course. We would still advocate, we're getting further and further into the pandemic, but I still think it would be worth getting bids to try to see if we could further expand capacity now, because speed is just so valuable. Let me turn slightly to the issue of the next pandemic. So in doing so, let me acknowledge some of the controversies around some of the US and UK efforts to do advanced contracting. So let me show this. This is an economics presentation, wouldn't be complete without a supply and demand diagram. So if you look at the yellow curve, you can think of this as the social value of a vaccine. That's highest, having more capacity makes this, the initial units of capacity are very valuable. Basically, the time until people are vaccinated is the number of people vaccinated divided by the capacity. So, once you've got a lot of capacity, additional increases don't provide as much benefit as the initial capacity. So that's the doubt, but the value of this is very, very high, as you can see. Think of the blue line as the short run supply schedule. So, and obviously we had very little information. These were very rough estimates, really conjectures. But I think while I wouldn't attach much meaning to the precise numbers there, what I would attach something to is the shape. And that's that in the short run, there are limits on how much supply can be created, because it takes so long to build capacity, and there's only so much capacity that can be repurposed. So that's why we had some area where this was relatively flat, but then it starts increasing steeply. Eventually, you have to start repurposing capacity used for other things or that isn't so suitable. So you can see that if you just let the market price, you'd be at a very high price, where the supply and demand curves intersect. But of course, we don't let that happen as a society. And so prices were much lower. We had shortages. In that type of a situation, you can argue, and I don't think we'll ever know the answer, what was the result of the US and UK expanding capacity and putting in these contracts? Maybe it shifted that blue curve out to the right and increased capacity for the world, and we'll have benefits for the world in the long run, because the supply will eventually benefit everyone. On the other hand, you could argue that in a world where capacity is limited in the short run, if one country buys up the supply, maybe that hurts other countries. There are effects in both directions. What I'd like to emphasize is the situation is very different if we think about things going forward, if we think about the future. In the long run, we can always build more capacity. And the costs of doing so are very modest relative to the costs of pandemics. So here I've drawn the red curve as flat, maybe that's extreme, as a perfectly elastic long-run supply. But we can build out more capacity. And what that means, I think, is that as we think about expanding capacity to try to address the future, to address future potential pandemics, it's actually in everybody's interest. If individual countries or if global entities build out more supply, then that's actually very good for the world, because they're not driving up the price for other countries. They're not creating shortages, but they are creating more capacity, and that capacity may indeed turn out to be very helpful in the long run, because we don't know where the epidemics will hit. Let me note that we should think about this not just as the actual vaccine production capacity, but as the supply chain capacity. We need many things to produce it, not just a factory, but quality control, inputs, trained staff, et cetera. So for future pandemics, we should invest now in standby capacity for both vaccines and for the inputs. We need standby capacity so we can rapidly expand production once we have the vaccines. We had the formulas very, very quickly. It just took time to test them and to ramp up production. We also need stockpiles of inputs and standby capacity to produce more inputs. We need to be able to install enough to rapidly vaccinate the world using each of multiple vaccine candidates, because we don't know which candidates will succeed. So we want to be able to not just have enough to supply the world, but to have enough to supply the world with each of several different candidates so we can build out quickly while we're still waiting for the results. That sounds costly and inefficient, duplicative, but this is like insurance. Even a small chance of the event, or maybe better than saying it's like insurance. It's like, do you want a fire department for your town? The chance that any one house catches on fire is very small. But collectively, this is something that's worth it because of the times when you need it. Okay. I also want to emphasize that having this capacity in place, not only if you look at this from a health point of view is it desirable, not only if you look at it from a benefit cost calculation is it desirable, but I also want to emphasize this is really what promotes equity. And one way to think about this is if you have a limited amount of capacity, and that means the queue to get vaccines is effectively 2 years long, so that the rich countries might get it quickly after a month. The poorer countries might have to wait 2 years. Well, we can try to change that, and we should, but it's also worth noting that if we expand capacity, and now we have twice as much capacity, and we can vaccinate the world in half the time, that might speed up things for a couple of weeks for somebody at the front of the queue. For somebody at the back of the queue, that speeds things up by a year. So it inherently promotes equity to have more capacity. Here's a point that's a bit more subtle, which is that putting capacity in place may help actually address the problems of vaccine nationalism. What we've seen in the current cases, there have been shortages, and that means governments have very strong incentives to vaccinate their own population first. We obviously are in a time of nationalism and populism, and that may make these forces even stronger. But I don't think it's just a matter of nationalism and populism. Any democratically elected government is going to have very strong incentives to serve their population. And so that leads to export bans, it leads to hoarding of vaccines. Moral persuasion alone, I think it's important, but by itself, it's not likely to solve the problem. If governments anticipate that, they might focus on trying to produce domestically. But that's extremely risky. That's extremely risky even for large countries like the US or for China. We happen to get lucky in the US. The mRNA vaccines were very successful. But what if the mRNA vaccines hadn't succeeded? What if other vaccines that were produced in China had been successful and ours hadn't been successful? It's, for the largest countries, this is risky. For small countries, this is going to be impossible. Australia tried to build its own vaccine. They failed. They got unlucky. We don't want to be in a situation where we rely on every country has to rely on itself. So, but what I'd like to point out is if we do have a lot of capacity and we do have the stockpiles, then that can really change politicians' incentives. If there's a shortage, then you want to grab for yourself first. If there's no longer a shortage, you don't have to put in these export controls. You don't have to hoard vaccines. The shortages can be self-fulfilling. If you see a shortage, then you think, oh, I better buy now. We've seen this in the US with toilet paper. I don't know what's happened elsewhere. This is something that we can help avoid by putting in the capacity. I think we need both national efforts to do this. Certain countries, regions will put in capacity. That's fine. I don't think that hurts other countries in the long run. You can argue it either way for COVID-19. But in the long run, this will be beneficial. So we should welcome national efforts, but we'll need to supplement them with global efforts because we can't expect the lowest income countries to be able to keep the standby capacity going. And there will be a cost to it. Things will go out of date. They'll need to be replaced. Let me turn to a broader issue, and thanks for mentioning the book. And this is the broader issue of patents and incentivizing innovation. So in our society, we have two very important needs. One is to get more research and development so we can get the vaccines we need and the other life-saving technologies. And the other is to provide access to them. And thinking generally, I'm not thinking about COVID-19 in particular, patents incentivize R&D, But the way they incentivize R&D is by providing a monopoly to whoever develops the new product. And monopolies in general tend to restrict access. And so that becomes not just a matter of abstract economics, but a matter of life and death in a pandemic. So that means that governments have very strong incentives during a pandemic to waive patents. But of course, that could hurt future incentives for research and development. So how can we get out of this area where we have an inherent tension? We pursue one objective, increasing research incentives, that might hurt access. We pursue access, that might hurt research incentives. I think we need to break out of this paradigm and think about other ways of incentivizing R&D. And in particular, we can do what we advocated in the book and was done for in a previous case before and has now been done for COVID-19 is advanced contracting. So what we advocate in the book, we focused on malaria, but after the publication of the book, was asked to help co-chair a commission that looked into how could we go from an abstract academic proposal to something in the real world, and the case that the political leaders decided to focus on was pneumococcus. Well, the commission, we were still just a commission, but then later this was taken up by political leaders. In fact, Italy was a key leader of this movement. It was the single largest contributor to this $1.5 billion commitment that I think Italy had been the chair of the, I believe it was the G8 at the time. Russia was still in. So there was a commitment that if firms developed a vaccine covering the strains of pneumococcus disease that affected low-income countries, then the donors would help cover the cost of purchasing this in exchange for a commitment by the companies to have to what's called a tail price, to not increase the price beyond that level after the end of the program. Well, following that commitment, 3 vaccines were developed. They've now been rolled out to hundreds of millions of people. And thanks to these vaccines, an estimated 700,000 lives have been saved. I don't think that I don't want to claim that all of that worked perfectly. We can always improve on how things are done. But I think that was an important lesson going into the COVID-19 case. And while the specifics were quite different for COVID-19, and we suggested some differences in the form of the contract, the basic approach of advanced contracting to make sure that you get sufficient quantity to serve an entire population, and I wish it had been the population of the world rather than just the populations of the US and UK, that basic principle seems to have been successful in both creating incentives for R&D and in creating access. Okay. Beyond this, I think it's worth thinking about how can we reform research institutions and methods. One issue with the vaccine trials is, normally these are kept confidential until the data is released, and there are good reasons for that. But because manufacturing takes so long, I think it might be worth trying to look for mechanisms to release partial data from the trials before the complete data is ready. Not so we can start putting the vaccines in people's arms, but so we can better plan the manufacturing. If we knew, again, we had the vaccines very, very early, it just took time to test them. We might wait for 95% confidence before humans get them, but we could start making the financial investments and scaling up production of the successful vaccines and redirect inputs from the unsuccessful vaccines earlier on, maybe when you're 80, 90% confident. Human challenge trials are a very controversial area. I think, however, so this is the old-fashioned method of testing vaccines, when scientists used to, deliberately inject themselves with the disease to test whether it worked. The advantage is they're very rapid. There are clearly some cases where this would not be at all ethical. Think about HIV when that came out, a fatal disease. There are other cases where this might be ethical. If there's a disease where we can identify for certain people it doesn't pose any danger, for other people it could be fatal, then perhaps we could do this ethically. I think we want to set up the committees now to think through the ethics so we can make appropriate decisions next time. And that also requires setting up some scientific infrastructure. I also think that we should examine in a pandemic, normally in designing a vaccine, and again, I defer to the next panelist, but you're trading off efficacy and side effects. In a situation in a pandemic like we are now, there might be advantages to going with smaller doses because more people could get the vaccine if you have a shortage. There aren't sufficient commercial incentives to do that. And so testing fractional doses, testing things like the first doses first approach in the UK, testing, mixing and matching, making sure we have institutions to do that early because the commercial incentives might be enough. It's important. I wrote down non-pharmaceutical interventions. Obviously, even before that, I should have said, we got lucky with vaccines this time. We need to think about, drugs, diagnostics, but also at least there in those situations, there's a company which can perhaps make some money if it's successful. For non-pharmaceutical interventions, I think it's tragic that we didn't have enough information quickly on what's the impact of masks, what's the impact of, now it looks like, perhaps school closures weren't necessary. A lot of children have missed a lot of school because of that. I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to pronounce on that. But I will pronounce on is we ought to have ways of getting the data much more rapidly. Ventilation and the role of aerosols. Maybe there's more we could have done had we known earlier. We should set up trials on this early. So let me leave it at that, and very much look forward to the rest of the panel.
Very effective, and I think you highlighted two episodes. One, given that the overall title of this festival is The Return of the State, or The State Strikes Back, an example of a tremendous success, so the fact that we were able to develop the vaccine within such a short amount of time, while normally it takes some 12 years, and there are many viruses that are still looking for a vaccine. So that was certainly an incredible, remarkable, and unexpected success. But also we had some failure, and the failures are in those mechanisms of self-fulfilling shortages that you were mentioning and of nationalism. You are also making a number of proposals that are very interesting, and I think that, Rino RAPPUOLI is a person who can really discuss this proposal, knowing very well the situation, knowing very well all of these shortages, the supply chain, and what are the limits and the pros and cons of a waiver on the licensing rule that has been advocated. So, Rino, thank you so much for being with us today. We are looking forward to your comments.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a really great pleasure to be here at this panel. I've been extremely interested in the lecture by Michael KREMER. I think it's very, very inspirational. Well, I'm not going to use slides. I'm going to talk to you in the next 10 minutes about my experience. I've been in the vaccine field for 40 years, and I've seen all these kind of things. And 1 year ago, when the pandemic started, all the vaccine experts, including myself, were asked, how long is it going to take to make a vaccine? And my answer, but the answer of Tony Fauci and all the key people in the field were, well, usually to make vaccines takes between 15 and 20 years. That's what it takes. We understand that this is a pandemic, we are in an emergency, so I'm sure we'll do much faster, but realistically, we'll not be able to make a vaccine before 18 months, and probably will be 3 years. That was the standard response that we gave a year ago. And most of the experts agreed on this type of response. Indeed, I'm very happy we're wrong. And we were wrong, by far, because vaccines, the first vaccine was licensed basically with emergency use application in the United States in 10 months. So why did that happen? Well, I think I can put together three main reasons. One, I mean, COVID vaccine was very easy to make. If HIV had been so easy or as easy as COVID, we were going to have an HIV vaccine in 1983. Because basically every single technology that's been used to make a COVID vaccine worked. So that's a good reason. In fact, today we still don't know how to make a vaccine for HIV, while we have 15 vaccines already licensed or about to be licensed for COVID. So first thing, the biology, the science was easy. The second thing is that we were ready with new technologies. RNA, today we all talk about RNA, but it's not new. RNA, we have been working from early 2000s on RNA vaccines. I've been working on it since 2008. And when we were ready, a year ago, when clearly RNA became a front runner, the technology was not mature for normal commercial products. Under normal conditions, without the pandemic, RNA vaccines were going to become commercially viable in 5, 7, 10 years. Why? Well, because only few phase 1 trials have been done. We knew a little bit how they were working, but we didn't have any study in formulations. I mean, they were, in order to make them work, we had to keep them -80. Normally, we'll never put on the, we'll never develop a commercial product that needs to be stored at -80. I mean, you have to work the formulation, it's gonna take 3, 4, 5 years, and then you put that in, you make available commercially. But then when the pandemic, basically said, who cares about -80? I mean, it's so important. And so basically we accepted non-mature products, not for safety, but for convenience, for formulation, for delivery, for supply chain. We accepted imperfect supply chain, and we said, let's go with the RNA. And now basically the pandemic has accelerated RNA as a new class of vaccines, but also a new class of drugs by 5, 10 years. So the first two things, one was the easy vaccine. The second, technology is ready to go. And similar thing was for viral vectors. Viral vectors have been around for a while. They've been validated by the Ebola vaccine, and they were ready to go. So, but they've never been used before in large scale. And these two technologies basically really changed the field because they move very quickly. However, we were not going to have a vaccine license in 10 months without the third, the most important factor. And that was basically the unprecedented investment of the public sector in developing these vaccines. And what happened was Warp Speed, 13 billion on the table. The major companies, the major runners, someone got 1 billion, someone got 1.2 billion, and others got 2 billion to develop vaccines, which means that basically, normally when we develop vaccines, we do things sequentially. First, we do discovery. If the discovery works, we do early development. If the early development works, we go into clinical trials, which means phase 1. If phase 1 works, we go in phase 2. If phase 2 works, we do phase 3. And then at that time, we make the investment to make a manufacturing plant. And the reason we do things sequentially is because at the beginning, the cost is pretty low, but you never make the next investment unless the first one is successful. And so because we want to manage the financial risk. Since to develop a vaccine more or less takes more or less $1 billion, I mean, you cannot spend all the billion in parallel. You invest the first 10 million, that works, you spend the next 30 and so on. Well, this time what happened was the public sector said, I don't care, I take the financial risk, and you basically develop everything in parallel. And that has been a new paradigm that had never been done before. And basically, the phase one, as soon as the phase one was, basically, we got the first piece of data, moved into phase two. And as soon as phase two data got the first results, phase three, and so on. And basically, everything has been done in parallel. Amazingly, and that's important for the people to understand, we took a big financial risk because the public sector took the risk, but we did not take any risk in about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines, because we did not skip any of these steps. We did phase one, the phase two, the phase three, everything was done, but was done in parallel instead of being done sequentially. So basically, what has really transformed the vaccine development, made things so quickly, has been the investment from the public sector. And that's the reason why we have the vaccines, and we have, at this point, more than 1 billion doses of vaccines produced in such a short period of time. So I think that's what happened. And obviously, what we are talking today is that, well, the rich countries, they got their own vaccines, but there's a lot of inequalities because most of the doses have been developed and deployed in rich countries. What are we going to do for poor countries? And it's going to take a while, there's no question. There are ways to accelerate. And there is a lot of discussion how we do deploy vaccines over there. And all the discussions, I mean, building more capacity is extremely important. Building capacity in those countries that don't have manufacturing is important. A lot of discussions, Africa doesn't have one vaccine manufacturer. We should do vaccines in Africa. We should build capacity. All these things are extremely important. Just want to say a couple of caveats, which is my experience with this, is that building capacity is not enough, because right now we need to make vaccines, but in 2 years, when the pandemic is over, we will not need 16 billion of doses of vaccines. We'll need much smaller amounts. And then you have overcapacity. And when you have overcapacity, basically, those plants which are not, that capacity is not being utilized, and will be shut down, because keeping the capacity up and running and ready to go it costs. So you cannot leave a manufacturing plant there empty, not doing anything for years. I mean, because you need to, the manufacturing plant needs constantly to be up to speed, to have the people trained, to have to be ready. I mean, to have all the license. So basically, keeping a plant is going to cost a lot of money, and nobody so far has been able to prepare and pay for those things. So I think it's very important that we keep these things in mind. That if we want to deploy more capacity, we also need to have a solution how to keep that capacity available when the emergency is going down. Because I've been there before, and as soon as the emergency is over, nobody cares anymore, and those plants are going to be shut down. They're not going to be available for next pandemic. So I think one important recommendation, I think all these things about the cost, the analysis of the cost of this pandemic and the benefits of vaccine has been incredibly good, what has been presented before. And frankly, I've been trying to fight the cost-benefit ratio that is usually used to evaluate vaccines. And I'm very disappointed that the last 20 years, we've not been able to increase the real value of vaccines. If you look at all the ways vaccines are evaluated, when you look at the cost benefit, I mean, we have been extremely good in evaluating the cost, extremely bad in evaluating the benefits, because the benefits, we don't include anything. There is nothing about what is the advantage of a vaccine because it's going to prevent a pandemic. There's no economic calculation that where those things are included. So I think if we really want to change the world, we need to change the paradigm by which we calculate the cost and the benefits of vaccines. And my as a non-economist, I cannot calculate exactly what it is, but my back on the envelope calculation is that I think the value of vaccines today economically is under-evaluated by a factor between 10 and 100. And if we just change that, we'll be able to convince governments, public sector, to invest in a sustainable way in research, manufacturing of vaccines. I think I should stop there and be basically see what the next things in the discussion is going to be.
Thank you so much. I think this conversation is suggesting that there's really scope for cross-fertilization between economics and microbiology. And thank you so much also for the effort in explaining in a very simple way difficult concepts scientifically and also reason in economic terms. I'm sure that Michael KREMER will say something about also this estimation of the benefit of vaccine and the cost-benefit analysis you were talking about. But before giving back the floor to Michael, let me just ask you something related to the proposal that he was putting forward. One is on research spillover, so whether there can be at an earlier stages a sharing of the result of the experiment, so that different companies correct the strategies in such a way to take into account of what is happening elsewhere. The second thing was this link between investment, public investment and pricing. So there has been substantial also price discrimination in this case, it seems to me. So I wonder whether the contract should have been done preventing this to happen. And finally, this idea of dose stretching in order to increase the coverage. So if you can tell us something about these three ideas.
Let me start from the last thing, and then I think those stretching and vaccine mixing and matching are very important, especially in a pandemic. However, the private sector does not have any incentive to do it because, I mean, any company would say, I'm developing my vaccine and I will try to deploy and sell as many doses as I can. So that's the public sector. Unless the public sector is going to do it, nobody's going to do it. They are very important. You want to stretch the dose, test that. You want to mix and match, do it. They're very important, but that's something that only the public sector can do. Or can incentivize company or force companies to do it. There is no other way. Now I forgot the first two questions.
Now, the research spillovers, we're sharing of the results of the early research on vaccine. Find better ways to...
Yeah, well, it's extremely important, clearly. But if we look back in this pandemic, that really happened. And we have seen that from the every single result has been published in preprints in real time. I think preprints, which are publication in preprints instead of peer-reviewed journals, was something that people in physics have been doing since 1960s. But in biology, we are very reluctant to do it. Well, the pandemic changed completely that picture. I mean, every single result was put on real time by companies, by universities, by everybody. It was a race to put the results, make the results publicly available. So I think that happened. There was a lot of collaboration that happened because of the emergency. So I think I agree it's extremely important, but it did happen, and I think that was a very important factor that contributed to the early success.
Thank you.
And then the last one was the
idea of supporting investment in exchange of having an agreement on pricing later on and avoiding price discrimination across.
Yeah, I think that's okay. I mean, I think that should be part of the discussion. I mean, if you obviously de-risk something, you have the right to say, I mean, I'm going to buy so many doses at the discounted price. That's fine. I think where companies will be reluctant is to have pricing control forever. I mean, that should, but pricing control for a pandemic or for the contract you have, I think that's perfectly fine. There are some companies that will say, I'm not going to accept your money because I make my own investment because I don't want my price to be controlled. But most of the companies actually accepted the negotiations on pricing in exchange of certainty of having a contract. So I think that's a good mechanism.
Very good. Thank you so much, Michael. Back to you. Michael?
Sorry, I was still muted. Thanks very much. No, it was wonderful to get this perspective, and I think I was struck really by how much agreement we have. That there's a very important role for the public sector in this type of situation, and financing, providing the financing to enable all of that work to be done in parallel. And I think that this experience, we've all suffered terribly from COVID-19, but I think one of the things that comes out of emergencies is the adoption of new technologies to address them. And we're seeing that now as we do the conference by video. But perhaps another technology is this meta technology, if you want to call it, this new approach of governments making advanced contracts to commit in advance that they will help finance the either commit to buy products if they're developed and meet certain criteria, as was done for pneumococcus or as was done for COVID-19. Commit in advance to fund the installation of all of the capacity and to fund the parallel development in exchange for vaccines, sufficient vaccines for their populations afterwards. And I think that approach of advanced contracting is something that we may be able to apply in other areas. Obviously, right now, the critical thing will be the most immediate need is to try through a variety of approaches to get capacity for the rest of the world.
Very good. Rino, you want to say something else? We have still a couple of minutes.
Well, the only thing probably I want to repeat something I said, because that's not visible to most of the people, because all these solutions are okay, and nobody discusses, and they said are inappropriate during the pandemic. But I promise you that in the previous pandemics was the same thing. During the pandemic, everybody agrees. But 2 years later, when we go back to normal things, basically everybody forgets about these things. And so now you have invested in plants, you have to shut them down because we are not proactive and we don't make the investment to keep them running. So I think whatever interventions we make has to be sustainable. Because companies will not make investments for waiting for the next pandemic in 30 years or in 20 years. I mean, they will go bankrupt. So it's the public sector that's the only one that can keep, as an insurance, the investment that we make open and working and sustainable when the pandemic is over.
Very good. So I think a lesson that we learned today is that indeed the public sector should invest more in vaccine production, in supporting in private investment in this field. And if anything, the EU has not done enough of that, compared also to the US and the UK. And there is also really room for cross-fertilization between economics and biology in various fields, including what Michael just mentioned, so improving advanced contracting. Another technology that today worked very well was video conferencing. As you know, we have been able to interact very quickly without any problem. But let me hope that next time we meet, we will be all in presence here in Trento. So thank you so much, both of you, for these very enlightening lectures.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you. Wonderful to meet you.
Nice meeting you.